So today I'm going to talk about performance benchmarks, or in this case how to get a full score on Google PageSpeed and GT metrics. So I'm just going to talk about why. These tests, they're made to check how fast your site can load. Basically it's made to find out why it isn't loading fast enough. So why do we want the site? Well, if your site is going to be slow, then people probably won't return to it, and they're going to sit there and wait for the page to load every time. And if the page loads are snappy, they might browse more pages. And Google actually cares if your site is very slow, then it's going to be get a less good of priority in search. And of course, when you know something can be better, well, as a nerd, I really want to improve it. So I'm just going over some terminology here because this might be a little bit advanced. First off, I'm going to be talking about my server setup, which in my case uses Nginx, Varnish, and Apache. All of these three are web servers. Nginx is a web server that's slightly less common. It's known for being very fast, capable of handling a lot of clients, and basically having very little requirements of a system. Varnish is known as, or is often used as a layer between the person visiting the site and the server, because it's only made for caching, kinda. Or that's one of its biggest purposes. Well, Apache is the most normal web server, and most people will be running Apache themselves. And I'm going to also mention Google PageSpeed model a lot, which is Google's effort at making it easy for people with who can edit their Apache and Nginx configurations to speed up your site. I hope I haven't lost too many of you already. So the first thing that these sites often are going to bug you about is something they call for render blocking, and this is something that Google has introduced pretty recently. When you test your site on Google's PageSpeed setup, it's going to check like how fast can it load and what's the problems with your site, and this is something that almost everybody will have issues with, and that is that at the top of your site in your code it's going to tell your site to include certain files such as styles and scripts, usually CSS and JavaScript. And while your browser is loading the page and is being told go fetch these files, and while it's doing that, it's waiting. It's not doing anything else. It's not preparing the rest of the site. It's just waiting. And Google says that this is very bad because, well, you want the site to load as quickly as possible, and anything that you need later, like fancy slideshow stuff, you can load that when the page is done. So you can see this guy over here. He's the guy that's the first person your site is going to ask for. That's the last guy you care about, probably. This is something they complain a lot about, and for most people it would be easy to fix. All your JavaScript goes down in the end of your page, makes it load a lot faster. It does have some pretty, Google is very strict though on how to get a full score on this. Amongst others, most sites, they will include a style sheet at the very start, and that's more or less it. While Google says, we only want you to load the styles that are absolutely necessary. So your site is supposed to look okay, but only when the page is already done loading, then you're supposed to fetch the rest. And if you don't do that, then you will never get over a 92 out of 100% score for mobile.
What about Google? They basically say that you need to include your scripts after the body tag or like in the header.
For this, they say that you should load your scripts at the very bottom, or at least not before anything that is above the fold. So you can basically put absolute fold. But the biggest problem with them is that they say with your CSS that you shouldn't declare everything in the head, and that's kind of a difficult one since that's the only valid way of including CSS. So what they want you to do is they want you to include only the basics, and then the rest you load with Ajax or JavaScript or whatever when you're done. Another thing is compression, and this one we should all care about because you save bandwidth and you don't do anything with the content. I mean, if you zip something up, it's going to be smaller. It's the exact same thing it does. Your web server is going to zip it up, it's going to forward it to, well, the visitor, and the browser is going to unpack it all by itself. This is very easy for if you have access to your Apache settings or Nginx settings, or you can just set up gzipping or mod deflate as it's called for Apache, and everything will be fixed by itself, and this saves loads of bandwidth. So for mobile users, this is gold. Another thing is caching, and it's not only because we want our servers not to be overloaded, but it's also because if you generate your site every time somebody visits, it's going to take way more time. The idea with caching is that if somebody visits my front page, I can take the results and I can store it separately for a certain amount of time, so that if 500 other people come to see the same page, I can just send them the same thing I sent to the first one. So you can say that if someone visits my site, then for the next 5 minutes, if they go to the same URL, they're going to get the exact same content no matter what. And that makes the site much faster. You can go from a site that takes 1 second to be rendered to only taking 30 milliseconds or less. With WordPress, this is fairly easy. You can just throw in a plugin like the free cache, and it will take care of most of the things. Or, like I did, I used Varnish. Other people like to use Memcache, but this will make your site seem a lot faster, also for users. And if your site takes more than 250 milliseconds to generate, then Google is going to say that you should consider reducing server load times. Another point is that you should minify all your scripts and styles and HTML. The idea is that although this looks very nice to code and to work in, nobody's really going to see that code anyways on your site. So you might as well pack it all up together, remove all unnecessary white space, and make the files much, much smaller and faster. This is, though, a pretty difficult one to get a 100% score, because those tests, they are going to bug you about every single byte that isn't optimized. So for a little over an hour, I was squeezing the last 7 bytes out of one of my pages in order to get a 100% score, because otherwise, if you have 99% score on every point, or on one point, and 100% on all the others, you're still getting a 99 score in total. So for me, the solution was to use the YUI compressor for JavaScript and CSS. It's very aggressive, and it was the only way I could get 100% results. For HTML, I had to use Google's PageSpeed mod with Apache, which minifies everything automatically. You don't have to do anything, install any plugins or whatever, it just does it for you. And without it, I wasn't able to get 100%. So the only reason I'm running Apache on my server as well is to get 100% on that one.
So, excuse me, are you running both Apache and...
Yes.
Okay.
I'm running Nginx in front, at total front. If you come and get a static file, it will be served from Nginx. So CSS, JavaScript, PNG, JPEG, everything goes through Nginx because it's so fast at returning the requests. If it's a document, it will go into Varnish, and if Varnish doesn't have the cache, it will go to Apache. Also, the reason I use Nginx is because my entire site runs on HTTPS, and Varnish doesn't support HTTPS. So the idea was anyway that I was going to have Nginx in front and then Varnish. Now the only difference I had to make was put Apache in the back as well. It's horrible to debug them. So the next point is optimizing images. Now this doesn't mean that you have to compress your images like this, but it does mean that, or you should compress your images somewhat. If you're going to use humongous PNGs, your site's going to be slow anyway. But the thing is that you can even optimize your images without losing quality. There are applications, for example, for Mac, there's Image Opt-in. And what it does is you drag in an image and it will make it smaller without throwing in any kind of compression or anything. It will just strip out unnecessary data and try to optimize the file. Now, it's not the most practical thing to do because, like me for example, I have a folder on my Mac, and each time I save a file in that folder, it will automatically be compressed by Image Opt-in. But it's going to cycle the file 1,000 times, and it's going to take enormous resources from your computer, which is going to get very hot very quickly. So it might be better to do it server side. So for example, PNG out and stuff like that, you can install on your server, and if you use it with a plugin like EU Image Optimizer, then it can automatically optimize all the images you upload in WordPress. And this can save you anything from 60 to 25% of the size of an image. And if you do that on all your files, you very quickly save like 20% on your whole site in terms of bandwidth. And also, again, the Google's PageSpeed mod is made so that you can enable it to automatically recompress and optimize all files on your server, all images. So then you don't even have to think about it. It just knows that when Apache requests an image, it will throw it through some filters and optimize it and resize it automatically, and you get way faster images and load times on your site. So another point is to reduce the amount of requests. Let's say that our site has 10 scripts and has 10 style sheets and loads of images. Now, the browser has to be going back and forth to the server all the time and has to ask like, yeah, now I want this image, and now I want this one, and now I want this one. And it's going to be kind of like it is here. Every single item you want from your site has to get into its own card and get back and forth. Well, if we combine files, put all your JavaScript files in one, put all your CSS files in one, use sprites for images, and sometimes if the image is small enough, we just throw it straight into the HTML without linking to another file. Then it can look much more like this. It's the same amount of files really, all the same data, we just optimize the way it's being transported back and forth between the server and the client. Now, for example, with combining files, there are plenty of plugins that do that totally for you. You just enable combine and they will throw them all together whenever somebody visits your site. And then if you then use caching, it won't take that many resources. Now, for example, if you have a small image on your site, sometimes it's better to throw it in straight the base 64 code of the image instead of linking to the image itself. The Google PageSpeed mod again will do a lot of this for you. It will automatically determine how big is the script that you are linking to. Is it so small that I should throw it in by itself, or should I include it with the other ones? And a lot of magic happens around there. The only problem with that is if you're developing your site still, you're still working on changes, it's caching it so hard that you can refresh it 1,000 times and it will still only give you the old stuff, and there's no way of really saying, well, now I want to purge the cache.
If you turn it off,
Yeah.
then it purges, don't it?
Yeah, if you turn it off, you restart Apache. And
Yeah. No, but just Google multi-page speed.
Yeah.
You can turn off each filter there,
Yeah, that's true.
and then you purge that filter, don't you?
Yeah, but you'll have to restart the.
Do you need to restart?
the configuration for it to take effect.
Okay.
At the end, when I was doing this, I'd been debugging things a lot, even between Nginx Varnish and Apache, because I had set up Nginx to take the JavaScript files. But when PageSpeed mod did the combining of them, I need to send it over to Apache again.
Yeah.
So in the end, I made a hotkey for restarting the whole stack just to get things up and running again. So results. What did this night of horror give me? I wrote a post about this on Bensmann.no that shows the results. So, for example, here on the PageSpeed test, I then get 100 out of 100, and it shows all of these points that I went over about optimizing images and priorities. And the same with the Pingdom test, where we get like a waterfall, we can see the performance, and also if you're debugging your own site, you can check here like what is going on, what is wrong. And again, if any of these give you 99 out of 100, you're not going to get a total 100. And then we have this one, which is pretty much the same. And the worst thing here is that this one will actually, if it says that your minification of HTML isn't good enough, it will actually give you an option to download how it should be. And then you can spend time to figure out where is that difference. because 7 bytes, you don't see those. I had to use a diff tool in order to see like a tiny difference. And I may mention that on YSlow, you can't get 100 without using a CDN. You'll just get stuck at 98. But that's, yeah. In the end, all of these are really guidelines, and it's like, nobody's going to expect you to have 100 out of 100, and it's not even practical. I had to do things to my site which I don't agree with. So for that reason, only my front page is optimized for the full score. If you go to any other page, you'll probably get 98 or 95 or something.
Really bad.
Yeah. So one of the points is that if I load my front page. So it required me to figure out what styles are most important to me and how does my site still look okay without the rest. It is then loaded. Let's see. So the CSS is in my case the very last thing that's being loaded into the page. And it will still work without it, but it won't look perfect. Let's see, disable JavaScript. So this is what it looks like before it loads the CSS. Now this is okay for me, and it's okay for Google to do it, because if you only have a search bar, there's not much styling to do. The same for me. I have this simple layout on my site, and it's going to look pretty okay if it's like this. But I just don't agree with loading the styles after.
Is the difference only with the fonts? Like I see there's different font views.
Yeah, that's one of the, or I really focus on getting everything that you see, like everything that's above the fold, or all the simple things should be in order. So yeah, my Google fonts, or the fonts I load from Google, if I loaded those at like rendering time, then they say I was wasting way too much bandwidth on that. So that's the biggest change here.
Is it noticeable when you load it? Can you see a flicker?
Yeah. See, it just goes up. So that's also one thing that, in reality, only the first time somebody loads your site is the time that they're going to be bugged by loading your CSS. After that, it's going to be cached and it's going to be pretty much instant. So, well, with the way Google says you should do it, they're going to have this flash of unstyled content every single time. And I think that that's way worse than having one page load that takes 10 milliseconds more. But yeah, I want 100 out of 100 page score, so what can I do?
People says tell us to.
Yeah, exactly. Are there any questions?
I just read about this today, so I haven't tried it out myself, but there's this thing called VP and Q in theme functions. Have you tried it out?
VP and Q?
Yeah. You can enqueue the JavaScripts, then so you don't have to load all the JavaScripts when you don't need it. For instance, if you have a slider on sub-page number 3 or whatever, you don't have to load the jQuery on the first page. You might load it on page 3.
Yeah, I use that for all of the things I use in my site. But the only problem I'm having is that since I combine all CSS files and then I minify them. So if somebody has to get 2 different versions of those, because I include a small JavaScript file somewhere else, then they basically have to load everything twice. So I did testing, and as long as I load everything and it's combined and it's minified and it's compressed and everything, then Google doesn't really seem to matter or seem to care. But if you don't do all those things, then definitely, enqueuing them and or registering them and only enqueuing them when they're needed is definitely something that's very, very important.
Can you do that with if you have some sliders on some pages and you don't use the enqueue but you use a post ID? Can you do that, or does Google think that's ugly? If page ID or post ID is that, then include that and that and that?
Well, in that case, or you probably want to load it. Yeah, you can do that. Google doesn't really care because you include it when it's needed, and they have been known to test another system for the page speed stuff, which gives you a bad score if you are including stuff that is relevant for things that aren't on your page. So if you're styling elements that aren't visible, it might be punishing you for it. And so they really like it if you only include it when it's needed. But the problem is that or especially with styles, it's not very maintainable if you're going to have 100 different files just in case every time. Yo.
Do you have Google Analytics running on the front page?
No. I had it self-hosted, but Google frowns upon self-hosting Google Analytics. But I was really considering making it a plugin, because anything other than Google PageSpeed will tell you that Google Analytics slows down your site, even by only a couple of milliseconds. Yeah.
How is your workflow regarding compressing and decompressing and minifying, and how do you, if you want to do some changes now, what do you do?
Well, like I said, I have a folder on my Mac in which all files automatically get optimized, or all images. I just have it called like images for web, and every time I throw something in there, it will automatically be processed. All the other stuff, it happens automatically. Every time there's a new combination of JavaScript files, the server will create a new minified JavaScript for those specifically. The same goes with the CSS. So if I change the version number of one of my CSS files, it will update the whole thing. And it's being minified, or the HTML is being minified on the fly as it's being served. So apart from the images, there's not really much I do by hand. But yeah, I had to spend some hours to get it running like this.
Just wondering, for us people who do not sort of go that far into the servers, we tend to have loads of plugins, like, I don't know, cache plugins and stuff like that. In my experience, they tend to just basically mess up the site, that stuff gets stuck there. Any recommendations, or like, is there any point actually using them at all, and if so, which ones?
Well, I host a site called WordPress, and in her case, I used one of those plugins, or W3 Total Cache, which solved a lot of issues because it made the site faster, and given I knew the site, the whole thing already, so I knew what it'd probably mess up or what would stay okay. But if you, in my experience, tweaking those settings gives you a lot more results per minute than it would do getting something like this. Because even getting those 80% right in only 20% of the time is going to help massively. But the minification and of CSS and JavaScript and caching plugins, those really mess up almost all the time, for me at least.
Yeah.
So right now I'm using a plugin made by one of my coworkers, and that didn't have any problems for me. That worked straight out of the box, and I can publish the link to it on the group later if that's of interest for someone.
Yeah.
One question, what kind of app do you use to, because I've tried to use minifying my CSS files, but I find it too difficult to, first code it in Coda and then minify it, and then if I want to make some changes, I have to do the whole process all over again. Is there a way to toggle between those?
I've used CodeKit to automatically minify. What I did in this case was, because what CodeKit does is you save your file and it can automatically minify it as well into a separate file.
Okay.
So you have two files lying, and one is called script and the other one is called script.min.js or something like that. And same with CSS. In this case, none of my CSS files are minified on the server. But when the plugin that I referred to earlier, when that is going to minify, or when it's going to combine all the files, then I run a filter on it that minifies everything. And I do this with the YUI compression on the server, which arguably isn't such a great solution because it uses 100% CPU for a few seconds or milliseconds. But then again, the minification is only once every month because I don't change this CSS and JavaScript every day. But yeah, I'd recommend checking out CodeKit.
I noted it down.
How much has speed to do with page ranking and general results? Do you know?
I'm no SEO guy, so all I know is that Google say that they will punish you for having a slow site.
Yeah.
But then there's the thing. After I did all these optimizations, my site was slow when it took maybe 200 milliseconds, and now it takes 40. But I don't think it punishes someone for being normal speed, and I don't think they're going to be like, well, this guy loads like 10 milliseconds faster than the other one, you should totally go check out them instead. So, but if your site takes like 2 seconds, then I think it will start saying, or pushing it down. So I don't think it really pulls you up. I think it only punishes you in case.
There's something about loading it with JavaScript in the bottom and things like on practically purposes on my mobile. It's really every pleasure to browse because you feel that it's actually delivering the page, not hanging for a long time and then you get all of the content. Yeah.
Some input on that SEO side of things where my site a few times I've got it close to 100 out of 100, but they were still taking over two or 3 seconds to load the page, and that was because I had massive numbers of images loading. And I'm fairly sure Google will be slightly penalizing me for taking that long to load a page, even though my test results come out high. The test results coming out high because I'm passing all of these tests. But since I'm downloading so many massive images onto the page, it still takes quite a while to load. So I'm assuming the search engine, this is an assumption, but I'm assuming the search engine punished me for having a really long page load time, even though I can pass almost a bunch of arbitrary
on
tests.
that note, the lazy load plugins, if you're thinking about bandwidth even, I mean, there are a lot of bloggers who have to pay because they have so many gigabytes of traffic flowing back and forth to the server that they're being charged extra. We're talking about several thousands a month only because they're basically being popular. And if you throw in a lazy load plugin which only loads the images when they become visible, that makes a huge difference. Because not everyone is going to scroll down every page. Let's say that only 10% scrolls down the whole page. That's going to be massive amounts of megabytes.
Yeah, just comment. I use Uniweb for some of the sites I have, and I know there've been loads of brute force attacks on that, and basically just like the servers have been amazingly slow. I mean, timeout, loads of time just uploading stuff to FTP. So probably you could have the best code in the world, but doesn't really help if the servers actually.
Yeah.
I mean, so just uploading a kilobyte and just timeout. I mean, it's just like ridiculous. So.
Just also a comment. I think you're absolutely right. Your hosting is very important. Try to avoid the cheapest Norwegian or Scandinavian ones and rather go for the cheap American ones who are actually better. I know that you can talk to Thomas about that. He has some good experience with some of them. And from our SEO department, I know that the general opinion when it comes to Google and punishment for speed is that you will get punished for really bad speed, but you won't gain anything for the Saturday night that Thomas spent optimizing his last 2%. That won't help you when it comes to Google. It helps his it's been quite hard to have lunch with over the last few weeks, but except for that, it doesn't help you when it comes to Google. But bad speed, yeah, definitely. And if you're having issues with your host having problems with attacks and not being able to deal with it, move on. They don't deserve your money. So move to someone else. There is plenty of good hosts out there that can actually deal with attacks. It's not that difficult.
I've had all of the sites on my server being attacked by that login attack lately, and it just sits there and chugs away. It doesn't make any noticeable dent in the performance of it.
No, I know, like on Uniweb I've had several pages from clients, and I mean, as I said, just uploading sort of installation file of WordPress like timed out several times.
They've just got too many sites on one server.
Yeah, I think they've got one dedicated WordPress server and just basically displays the whole thing.
It's not a question, it's more a friendly request. Can you go to Google PageSpeed just to test the site that I'm trying to copy? It's runharrier.net. Can you just message?
Oh, that's not going to be good.
Like this?
No, I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's it.
Now I've primed your cache as well, so.
It's not going to help. It's going to be really bad.
I know.
Yeah. instruction.
So this one right here is what I was talking about to begin with, about loading the styles and the scripts in the start. And you can have the smallest site and you're still loading a CSS file, it's going to be bugging you about that one. And that's another thing, that if any of you really are going to think like, yeah, I'm going to do this, I'm going to get 100 overall, then just one thing to be prepared about is that when you get the 100 out of 100 on the first one, then the second one will probably be lower than it was by the time you started, because they all have their own things. Like one of them thinks that this is more important, the other one says that this is important, and if you emphasize on one, it's going to probably burn you on the other. So in the end, it's like, well, now I got a 98 here, and I got a 99 there, and now I got 100 here, and oh, I got 97 there, but now I get 99.
That's why I'm trying to copy it and optimize it and upload it as a brian.net.
But Thomas, if this is your current point, right? What is your recommendations in order to like do something but not everything, right?
Yeah.
Is it Google's own mod speed for the web server, or
that is more of it's kind of blindfolding yourself and saying, well, this is probably going to go okay.
Yeah.
And I remember trying it the first time a couple years ago, and I was like, oh, this is awesome. And loads of stuff load faster and it all looks nice, but if you're really going to change stuff, there's caching all over the place and you're not really in control. So, I mean, if you weren't in control to begin with, it's probably okay, but if you really know what's supposed to go on your server and suddenly things are totally different than expected and there's no real way to configure any of it, then I wouldn't say that would be the way to go. But I'd say turn on gzipping on your server, which makes everything smaller. You save basically loads of bandwidth without doing anything. It's all just all macro. Then throw in some minifying and combining of CSS, then you will have a pretty good score already. Use the tools as guidelines. If it says 98%, then go on to the next one. Find out what the issue is. You might as well be scoring 50 on just because your images are PNGs instead of JPEGs. So focus on the big stuff, the few percents at the end. Nobody's going to notice. It's only going to be harder to maintain.
What's a good score in your eyes? Like, when do you have to worry about your site?
That's a hard question.
More than anyone, I'm thinking.
I know. It's a really hard question actually, because I always want to get it slightly higher. I know that with mobile, 92 out of 100 on Google PageSpeed, that's excellent. That's the best you can get without doing stuff you don't really want to do. So I'd say already 85 on mobile and 90 on desktop would be, yeah, like don't even bother doing anything more because it's totally fine. Yeah.
Did you manage to keep web accessibility guidance like on your site? Did you manage to keep the W3C guideline thing going? Yeah.
It's still valid. I didn't really change any. My goal was to not change anything content-wise, because it's one thing to set up a demo site that just does this, but I was like, I want to do it on a site that I already have, something that I use. Well, I was going to say daily, but maybe monthly. Yeah. I didn't really want to change anything, so the only thing I did to the theme and to my WordPress setup was the minification of CSS and JavaScript. Otherwise, it's all the way it was. One thing though is that one of the tests was only giving me 99% out of 100 because I had an unnecessary attribute in my HTML. I was using like type equals text / JavaScript, and because of that I wasn't getting a full score. And so I might be changing stuff like that, but that's then again in accordance to the HTML5 guidelines.
Yeah, one thing that a lot of WordPress users have are a bazillion high number of sharing icons, and a lot of those slow down your site really, really, really bad. So you don't necessarily have to remove all your sharing icons, but at least stay to the 2-3 that are used in Norway. You don't get, if you have a Norwegian site, you don't gain anything by adding a sharing icon for a site that is only used in China or Brazil. So don't enable like 10 different sharing icons like Orchid and things like that. It won't give you anything. And also look at how you include them. Using the default sharing icon from Facebook is not necessarily the best way to do that.
So even just waiting after the page is loaded before showing them is going to save you a lot of bandwidth. I saw an article about this, a guy who had made it that only when you are in a radius of 300 pixels of the sharing stuff, then it's actually loaded. So you're on your way with your mouse, going up to the share button, and it's kind of there, but it's not really there. And by the time your mouse is there, it's loaded. Again, this was probably some nut just like me who really was squeezing every bite out of the site. So.